Hello, family, and welcome back to our live coverage from St. Peter's Square here with the beautiful sunset behind us with my co-hosts, Monsignor Landry from the Pontifical Mission Societies USA. He's their national director, and our editorial director and vice president, Dr. Matthew Bunson for EWTN News. It's really kicked off with quite a bit of excitement, a lot of work that these Cardinals are doing. They're still locked in there. 252 of them, not the 133 that we expect to be doing the work once everything is sealed on Wednesday morning, but still a lot coming out of those general congregations, those moments where they're doing this business to try to prepare, where a couple of people are allowed in who we wouldn't normally expect to be allowed to have these conversations. What are you hearing, Monsignor Landry, from the Cardinals? What's their spirit? We know you've got the ear of a couple of them.
There's a lot of expectation in terms of what's coming. There was a concern that they wouldn't have enough time to hear all the Cardinals who wanted to speak. They were a little confused why some Cardinals have already spoken 3 times and some haven't yet spoken, why that would be taking place. But they think that the discussions are substantive. They've been very moved by some of the interventions, some of the little speeches that were given, 5 or 6 minutes or so. But they're starting to feel the countdown interiorly because within 2 days they get sequestered in the Sistine Chapel and the Casa Santa Marta in order to do what they've been waiting ever since their nomination as a cardinal to be able to do for the church.
We know, based on the Bollettino from the session this morning, that there were a number of topics, as they always do. One was on sort of evangelization of the church, which is something they keep coming back to, how the church can communicate. They focused, I noticed, very heavily, and we can talk more about that, on Dei Verbum, on the Word of God. It's a place of Scripture in the life of the church. They were also looking at, interestingly, the profile of a pope. And there were 2 things that jumped out. The first is, of course, they're looking for a pastor. So that could be an indicator, perhaps something against one of the leading candidates. We can talk more about that, too. But then also the idea, they said, of someone who believes that communion should be broadly open to people, so welcoming in. So we're seeing some of the same discussions play out here on the questions of the Eucharist and the questions of also communion and unity in the church. And my favorite factoid for the day was that they confirmed that on Saturday they did a lottery to see who goes where in which room in the Casa Santa Marta and also the Santa Marta Vecchia, because there are more Cardinals and they actually have space in the new Casa Santa Marta.
Can you tell our listeners and our audience, obviously watching us from around the world, a little bit about the Vecchia? Where did that come from? What's the history there?
So there used to be this house called the Santa Marta, well before this new residence was built, and a few of those who worked in the Vatican apartments there. What's a somewhat well-known fact is that Archbishop Vigano, former nuncio of the U.S., was booted from there by Pope Francis after he started publicly attacking Pope Francis after he served as the nuncio in the U.S. He used to have an apartment there even when he was nuncio in the United States, and when he'd come to the Vatican, that's where he'd stay. And so the same guy who was raising a prophetic voice against any and all forms of corruption in the Vatican had kept this apartment, even though he wasn't using it except for a couple weeks a year when he would come for meetings here in the Santa Maria Vecchia. And so not only are there a few apartments in there, but there's also been the offices of the Commission Against Child Abuse throughout the church. And so Cardinal Sean O'Malley's office is partly there and partly down by the Pantheon. And so his team needed to move themselves out of their offices. And where desks used to be, there are now beds in order to house 5 of the Cardinals who wouldn't be able to fit inside the Santa Marta Nova, we might be able to call it, the new St. Martha's.
And do those 5 have to walk a little more than the others?
Just a little bit.
So literally, I've had the privilege to stay at the Doma Sancta Marta many times. I anticipate everybody's going to come in the same way, and there is a cancello, they call it, a gate that is locked with a pathway to the Doma Sancta Marta Vecchia, in which I think the Cardinals are just going to be able to walk that way so that everybody's entering the same way, all the typical security to make sure that there's no outside influence would be prevented, etc. That's what I anticipate is going to happen.
So yes, there is more walking.
Yes, just a little bit. Yes, I think it's an important point, just so everyone remembers that when you pull the short straw, it comes
Right.
with some consequences. Well, let's go back to the work that the Cardinals were doing this morning, obviously in that 10th session, and right now in the 11th session, where they're really getting in there to prepare to do all of the pre-conclave work, get to know each other. They're walking in. We've got some very intrepid journalists who go and take their pictures and try to catch and see if they're grouping themselves in one way or another, trying to get to know each other. The ones that we know are coming from the peripheries and may not have had access. It's a great joy to see them walk in together when you know someone from Mongolia who probably doesn't know the Cardinal from Chile. And they probably admire each other by reputation, but have never had that fraternal moment. So we did see some of that. Valentina Di Donato, who is one of our correspondents for EWTN News, was out there and did get the Cardinals to tell her a couple of things. Let's take a listen.
The Church needs what is stated in the Second Vatican Council's Gaudium et Spes, the joy and hope of humanity, joy and hope of the disciples of Christ. I still don't know who I will vote for. For now, I don't know anything. This is the first time I am here at the meeting of Cardinals.
We are discussing, we are listening to each other to have a real, a concrete idea about the new Pope. We cannot vote for someone who we don't know him.
It's beautiful, so that's why I'm at peace. I'm sure that in the end, there's one we are meant to discover, and the Lord has already named him in his heart. That one we must discover, but among many beautiful and strong personalities.
Algeria, Jakarta, Iraq, countries that are not very close to each other, but that same message, that uniting message of, it's my first time here, or please, we want to listen to the Holy Spirit, we're prayerfully walking into this moment. How do you receive that, Monsignor Landry? What do you think is what they want to tell us? Because the reality is they were told not to speak to the press.
But they've noticed that several have been giving interviews, and so that loosens their lips in general. If others aren't playing by their man-made rules, not divine, they'll say some things that aren't revealing any of the stuff that's technically under oath about their business. They're talking about their own stuff in their own sort of perspective. I'd say two things. One, we should all be happy that they're approaching this not like a political convention, but they're approaching this as a discovery of who God wants, and that's exactly what we've been praying for them to do. The second is when they say at this point they really don't know who they're going to vote for, I'm wondering when they're going to come. I hope it's not at the last second when they actually sort of check if their pen works and they're writing down and coming and folding it in two and about to put it
with their Pontifical Mission Society's pen.
Well, some have the Pontifical Mission Society pen, and everybody else is going to be envious.
That's very true.
One of the things that's really jumps out when you hear clips like this, when we have a chance to talk to them, you're absolutely right. There was nothing revealed about the general congregation, but they were actually speaking from the heart. It was rather moving. 108 of them were named by Pope Francis. That means 108 of them have never been through this experience before.
Right.
We know they don't know each other, and that was noted here too. But also this idea that there's a certain trust here that God, as he says, has written this in some ways, but we also still have to cooperate. And then that idea too of, I haven't decided who I'm going to vote for. In some ways, I think they're also waiting to the very last moment to hear every possible perspective before they go into that. And I think they're going to do it prayerfully.
And the structure and the kind of pomp and circumstance of the conclave itself, the idea that you go in, the rules are set, there is a process for everyone to be chosen within their roles, is going to help them in that, I believe. They're really listening with their hearts, like you said. They're taking it all in to be able to make this decision, but the structure itself will carry them into this moment, of course, for the benefit of our audience, because the doors will be closed and we won't be able to report in real time on what is going on in there. We want to make sure that everyone knows who they're going to be seeing at the window, what those roles are going to look like, and who those names might be. Let's take a listen to this package from EWTN News. Well, let's see if our control room can pick it up. In the meantime, we can.
The word conclave, from the Latin cum clave, which means closed with a key, evokes in our minds images of an orphan church that expectantly awaits the name of who will be the next successor of St. Peter. It makes us think to the cardinal electors gathered behind closed doors in the Sistine Chapel, where Michelangelo's universal judgment reminds us that they will have to give an account to God at the end of their days. But the word conclave also brings to mind the city of Rome. St. Peter's Square packed with the faithful who stare without blinking at the roof of the Sistine Chapel, waiting to see the color of the smoke from a chimney that will announce to the world the result of the votes. Well, throughout the history of the Church, the election of pontiffs hasn't always been this way. In fact, until Pope Gregory X, successor of Peter number 184, the conclave as we know it today didn't exist.
Some analogous form of enclosing the cardinals to elect the Pope had happened on some preceding occasions, always because the king and the emperors in Europe tried to apply pressure so that their favorites or those who favored them would be elected. The most striking case was in Viterbo, where it took 3 years from 1268 to 1271 to elect Tedaldo Visconti, Gregory X. On that occasion, after 2 years of indecision from the cardinals, the population locked them in with a key. Then they opened up the roof and left them bread and water to see if they'd decide. Given the situation that was created, Pope Gregory X promulgated this bull, Ubi Periculum, with which he formalized a series of rules to respect for the election of the Pope, thus formally instituting the conclave. And so, it established that within few days, the cardinals must gather in the place of the death of the Pope, locking themselves in a place out of contact with the outside world. And then an entire series of restrictions, also material ones, precisely to induce them to keep the time brief for the decision.
Ad avere tempi brevi nella decisione.
But who was Tedaldo Visconti from Piacenza, and how did he become Pope Gregory X?
Gregorio X, al secolo Tedaldo Visconti di Piacenza.
Gregory X, then Tedaldi Visconti di Piacenza, was elected in 1271, which we could call the Proto-conclave at Viterbo. His body is buried inside the cathedral. The cardinals who elected him in Viterbo agreed on this name after 3 years of sede vacante, also known as the empty seat. Tedaldo Visconti wasn't a bishop or a priest, but simply a deacon. But they chose him for his diplomatic skills. At the moment of the election, he was in the Holy Land, and from there he was called on to return to Rome. But his mind remained forever tied to the Holy Land, so much so that the main climax of his papacy was the organization of a crusade to liberate the holy places. Gregory X was returning from the Council of Lyon to Rome, and during the trip he decided to spend the Christmas festivities in Arezzo, which, at that time, was an important theological center between the Apennines and Rome. Gregory X knew many people in Arezzo. He was welcomed by Bishop Guglielmino degli Orettini in December of 1275. Unfortunately, he was already sick with a fever, and surely his condition worsened, and on January 10, 1276, Gregory X died. Before dying, though, he left the city 30,000 gold florins, the sum that allowed for the construction of a new great cathedral in the center of the city.
In urbe, al centro della città.
Historians have two hypotheses about which was the precise place that the first conclave was celebrated, but what they have no doubt about is that it was in the city of Arezzo, and that Blessed Gregory X had the idea for this institution.
Un'ipotesi è questa collocazione.
A hypothesis is this placement here. where there already was a settlement of Dominicans, where the current basilica now is. Another hypothesis is the Church of St. Gregory, where today the cathedral and the bishop's residence are located, which are successive.
Today, the body of Blessed Gregory X lies in the Cathedral of Arezzo, built thanks to the generosity of the very same pontiff, who from simple deacon in the Holy Land was called to Rome to occupy the Petrine See as the successor to St. Peter and head of the Universal Church.
So we ended up watching something that gave us some background on the first conclaves. Where did this tradition come from? And I do think in talking about what is going to carry these new cardinals from the peripheries that are just getting to know each other, it is that history and tradition. What is your initial reflection on the beginnings of this process to elect the successor of St. Peter?
There was a practical reason, not a theological one, behind much of what we're doing here and much of what the church has done over these last 755 years. There it was a desperate situation where they were waiting for 3 years. Some people have said the Casa Santa Marta is too nice and they might not mind having a good night's rest, whereas when they used to be setting up cots in the Sistine Chapel behind us, they wanted to get out of there pretty fast. I don't think that the Cardinals have any real taste to have a conclave that would last even a couple of weeks now. But everything started then, and then it started to lead to these various traditions and customs that have sprung on up, including the whole custom of secrecy, to try to almost force them to make a decision that's going to be good for the whole church. The real tradition is that the people want a pope. They don't want to be like sheep without a shepherd. And so the people in Viterbo really took matters into their own hands in an unforgettable way. All of us are taking matters into our own hands with calloused knees and folded hands.
That's exactly right. I think that's one of the illusions that Cardinal Dolan always makes, which is, I hope they don't starve us, right?
Well, one thing to bear in mind is that the conclave system is not foolproof, and what I mean is that I think it was in the election that brought in Benedict XIV back in the 70s. That itself took 6 months. So even the idea of being locked in could create deadlocks. But the whole idea is to prevent exactly what happened, and then we can see in the evolution of papal elections that it's also making sure that there isn't outside interference, because that's always been a concern. You know, the conclave in 1903, there was grave concern about that. In fact, one of the candidates was sort of set aside, Cardinal Rampolla, by one of the great powers of the time. So there's always this belief and a concern that we cannot have that outside sway over what happens inside. And the idea of everything from like burning ballots, you can trace that back many, many centuries, even before the conclave system was introduced. Why? Because of that secrecy. You want to protect what happens in a conclave so it's not used maliciously by somebody down the road. This is an era, too, of anti-popes, where emperors and kings would set up a rival claimant who had no legitimate claim, but they might then be at risk of having some of these discussions in a conclave used against a sitting pope.
Which is something that I think comes into modern times with governments trying to set up their own churches and nominate their own bishops. Right. So an interesting kind of contrast.
Nothing is ever really new, is it?
That's right. Ever ancient, ever new, even in the bad stuff. But that common language, like you were saying yesterday, Monsignor Landry, Latin, why it's so important, why it keeps us rooted in this tradition, why it also gives us a common language for all of them, with all of the languages now especially expanding the places that they come from, giving them a common language to pray in. Why is that so significant?
Most of the cardinals are going to be able to pray in Latin just fine, and normally they would pray morning prayer and vespers in the Sistine Chapel together. But it's speaking the language and understanding. Presently, when they're having these general congregations, there are translators for all the languages, not only so that they can understand listening to others, so that they can speak likewise in their native tongue. Once they get inside the Sistine Chapel, there are no translators. If you're not understanding Italian, or you're not capable of speaking in a language that others understand, you're at a notable disadvantage. And so one of the things that takes place is they lean to the left or they lean to the right, and they say, can you help me? And so what is being stated live has got to be translated for them. eventually we need to look at that. I think it'll stabilize itself over the course of time. We're still in the transition from everyone mastering Latin to a situation in which most are coming without many years of Latin. And so there is going to be a need for a common language. It's probably going to be Italian. English and Spanish are likewise contenders. And if somebody would know those types of things because of preparation, then it's going to be much easier to manage all of these things well and leave the Sistine Chapel onto the Loggia della Benedizione as a potential pope who's able to speak in the mother languages of so many of the Catholics throughout the globe.
Which we know is so important. Well, Matthew, one of the points that I would like for you to clarify is the undue influence of the previous pope. You're getting a lot of rumors coming here. One was about the conclave start moving, which we know was not something that was discussed today. It was not in the minutes from the meeting. I don't believe it will be in the minutes from the 11th session, which will close shortly. But the idea that we are starting on Wednesday, and also that Pope Francis didn't set things up to ensure continuity with his beliefs.
Correct. On the one hand, you can say that, yes, he has left his mark very clearly on this conclave.
Certainly.
108 of these participants were appointed by him. So his mark is there. But the idea, a la the movie Conclave, that somehow the dead pope is reaching from beyond the grave, having orchestrated very carefully the election of his successor, it simply isn't the case. There is a somewhat, it's not crass, but they always say that there's nothing is more dead than a dead pope. And what they mean by that is that when the pope has deceased, the church mourns him, but now we're moving on in the sense of finding his successor. And it's a reference, too, to the fact that the influence of the deceased pope can reach, but not in the way that people are certainly suggesting. Rumors about that are simply not true. In part, it's also a grievous insult to the members that he picked and all the members of the College of Cardinals, that somehow they can't think for themselves, that they can't prayerfully discern who should be his successor.
Absolutely.
Pope Francis cared way more about his funeral in changing some of the rituals with regard to how he would be buried, what would happen in the funeral mass of a pope, than he did about putting his fingerprints on the constitution that governs what's happening here. He didn't change it at all. He trusted that the men that he had chosen and that his predecessors had chosen would do just as they did in 2013, just as they had in 2005, just as they had in 1978 and beyond. And so that is a big sign from the Holy Father that if he trusts them, the whole church should have a certain basic confidence.
That's right.
And there were rumors that he was planning to do some changes to the way that the general congregations were going to be handled. That didn't happen. He could have reverted back to the rules of 2005, where after a certain number of votes, you have a simple majority. No, he stuck with the 2/3. So if there's any truth at all to the idea that he's trying to influence this, that would have been the place to start.
He was way more interested in some of the roles that he gave to women, I think, which were last-minute changes right before he went into the hospital and one from the hospital.
Yep.
And I do think that it was interesting to see him reappoint some of the people who had been in the previous conclave. So let's take a look at the continuity there then. Who are these individuals who are leading in one way, some chosen by chance, by lot, right?
Yes,
Some
exactly.
chosen by the majority of their brother cardinals, and some certainly appointed by Pope Francis.
After the death of a pope, the overall care of the affairs of the church falls on the College of Cardinals, currently 250 men aged 45 to 99. But to those under 80 falls the task of voting for the successor to the chair of St. Peter and announcing it to the world. The choreographed processions of oaths, rituals, and ballots is executed by cardinals appointed previous to the Pope's passing, chosen by fellow cardinals, or drawn by lot. The first and most visible role is a Cardinal Camerlengo, the administrator of the Church's temporal affairs during a sede vacante. The current holder of the office is the Irish-American Cardinal Kevin Farrell. As the caretaker of the day-to-day operations necessary to continue running the Vatican during the interregnum, he verifies the Pope's death, seals his apartments, and organizes the funeral rite. While this role is significant in managing finances and executing logistical preparations for the conclave, it is not a role that plays a significant part once the doors of the Sistine Chapel are closed. The Camerlengo does not assume spiritual leadership, but works with other officials to ensure everything is in order for the election. Another significant pre-conclave role is that of the preacher to the conclave. That task falls to the Capuchin Cardinal Raniero Cantalamessa, the emeritus preacher of the papal household. He will deliver the pre-conclave meditation to help cardinals reflect spiritually on their responsibility and would typically be a non-voting figure at 91 years old. Cardinal Cantalamessa's role ends on Wednesday afternoon. Elected by the most senior cardinals of the college and confirmed by the Pope, the Dean of the College of Cardinals is first among equals. The current holder, Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re, presides over the pre-conclave meetings called the General Congregations, leads liturgical functions including the Mass for the election of the Roman Pontiff, now scheduled for Wednesday morning. Were he under the age of 80, he would ask the newly elected Pope if he accepts the role of Pontiff and what name he will take. But since Cardinal Re is 91, that task falls to the Vice Dean, who would execute that function as well as assume Cardinal Re's role in the conclave. That brings us to, up next in significance, the Vice Dean of the College. The Vice Dean is appointed as a fallback in case the Dean is unable to perform his duties. While Cardinal Leonardo Sandri is the current member elected to the role, he is 81. So now it will be Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Vatican Secretary of State, who is responsible for presiding over the work of the conclave. He would otherwise play a quiet advisory role behind the scenes. If for some reason Cardinal Parolin is unable to perform this duty, the next in line by seniority among the cardinal bishops is Cardinal Fernando Filoni. The largest and most significant group is that of the cardinal electors, or the voters. All cardinals under the age of 80 are eligible to vote. They swear an oath of secrecy and are secluded until a pope is elected. As of now, 133 of the 135 eligible electors will play the primary role of discerning and electing the next pope. After Mass is celebrated, the body of electors processes into the Sistine Chapel and the doors are ceremonially locked. Oaths are taken and the voting begins. Voting is run by 3 sets of election officers. These specific voting-related roles are assigned by lot. Each voting session begins with the preparation and distribution of paper ballots by 2 masters of ceremony who are among a handful of non-cardinals allowed into the chapel at the start of the session. Then the names of 9 voting cardinals are chosen at random for each session, 3 to serve as scrutineers or voting judges, 3 to collect the votes of any sick cardinals who remained in their quarters, called infirmari, and 3 to serve as revisers, to double-check and verify the vote count for accuracy. 9 new cardinals will be chosen for each voting session. One of the few non-cardinal electors allowed in the room between the votes is the secretary to the College of Cardinals. The 60-year-old Brazilian Archbishop Ilson de Jesus Montanari was named secretary in 2014 and will continue in this role, providing administrative support to ensure a smooth process. The liturgical master of ceremonies, or master of pontifical liturgical celebrations, is named by the Pope. Currently, Archbishop Diego Ravelli, he was assigned this role in 2021. Key in the final moments of the conclave, he will draw up a document certifying the consent of the man elected and the name he has chosen, with the witness of 2 assistant masters of ceremony who are summoned for this moment. 2 other roles are significant in then bringing the news to the faithful. The junior cardinal deacon, currently Cardinal George Cuvacad, selected by virtue of his status as the most junior cardinal from the ranks of cardinal deacons, will be the one tasked with closing and opening the chapel doors. And then, the proto-deacon, the role held by Cardinal Dominique Mamberti, the senior cardinal deacon of the college. He has the task of announcing the name of the new pope, who then gives his blessing to the people, the city, the church, and the world. For EWTN News, in the Vatican, I'm Matthew Bunson.
Well, Dr. Bunson, I think that you showed off your deep knowledge of this process, knowing that you've pored over the Apostolic Constitution for us and all of the other documents to make sure that we could share this with our audience. There are a couple of things in that description, which is very quick, that I think are really worth noting. These voting sessions are very intense, and they are kind of a rinse and repeat. With none of the players, except a couple of them, staying where they are.
That's right.
Particularly those 9, right? What can you tell us about those sessions?
Well, each voting session, so there are 2 sessions each day, 2 in the morning, 1 in the morning, then 1 in the afternoon, with 2 votes each, until you have somebody who can reach the 2/3 supermajority. After the first session, the scrutineers and others keep that job. But then, for the afternoon session, it starts all over again. So not only is it remarkably democratic, not only is it remarkably random, but it's very egalitarian. Everyone has an opportunity to serve in exactly the same way that you could end up with a terrible bedroom at the Casa Santa Marta based on lots. It's entirely... The thing about the University de Medici Gregis, however, the document that oversees this, is it is granular in its detail. It seemed to have tried to anticipate every possible weird scenario that can happen, from ballots that might be folded incorrectly or an extra ballot was tucked in there. But it's very clear that a great deal of thought went into this process of trying to make this as fair as possible, and also within the body as transparent as possible.
The backup for the backup seems to be something that is really consistent in this process.
You see that they want to make sure that everybody knows that it's fair. So it's not just one person initially counting the ballots. It's not just 2, so the 2 of them can disagree and fight. There were 3 there. So everybody's going to know that this name was actually the name there, and they were able to discuss. So like the last time, for example, instead of Bergoglio, somebody wrote Broglio, who is Archbishop Timothy Broglio, the president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and the Archbishop of Military Services in the U.S. So Archbishop Broglio mistakenly got a vote. When somebody's handwriting's terrible, that's where the scrutineers begin to sort of look and say, it's this person's name. And then you've got the revisers later to look and give a totally second opinion, not just 1, but 3. And if the infirmary actually needed to go to the Domus Sancti Marte or the Domus Sancti Marte Antica.
A little further away.
Did have a box, and there were 3 people to see that that happens the way that it should, so that nobody's going to be able to challenge the fairness of an election. I think over the course of 775 years, they've worked out the possibilities for corruption and eliminated them.
Now, you mentioned handwriting. Gentlemen, isn't it true that they're supposed to kind of disguise their handwriting?
That's
but
correct.
It's supposed to be legible. At a practical level, somebody's really going to have to be more focused on more focused on calligraphy than Matthew is on University de Medici Gregis in order to be able to discern which of 133 names was written by whom. But at the end of the day, the larger issue is, can you read somebody's handwriting? Because some of the times they would make doctors look like calligraphers.
This is true. Plus, you have some of the cardinals who are in their 70s, late 70s.
That's right.
You have others who may have medical conditions that can create difficulties. So there are also provisions in there that you can have help. For example, if the infirmari arrive and that the cardinal who is unwell needs help, they will provide it to him. But that's why you also have these 3 witnesses. So you have witnesses for every step of the way. And then the box that it goes into is locked. They take it back to the Sistine Chapel. It's opened. It is examined exactly like every other ballot. So as I said, it's granular. It's sort of like stereo instructions. But the music that it can produce is pretty nice.
But Matthew, is it true that we might be in that situation where the infirmari will actually have a role to play in this conclave?
Yeah, so there's a little bit of a discussion today about the fact that there were 132 electors participating, but they also said that 133 are now in Rome. So my understanding is that there's going to be at least 1 cardinal who will be assisted into the Sistine Chapel to start to take the oath, but then is very likely to avail himself of one of the Santa Martas to be able to vote each time, but with the help of the infirmari. And again, that's where the provisions come in. There's also one fun I call it fun. It's fun for the person. It's the person who receives it. It's fun. There is a very long-standing tradition that at the end of the conclave, the newly elected pope, of course, he has a scarlet zucchetto that he doesn't need anymore. That he will take that zucchetto and he will hand it to the secretary of the conclave. In this case, Archbishop Montanari.
That's right.
The exact same practice, my understanding, was done in 2013, where Pope Francis gave his red zucchetto to Leonardo, Baldassare, Cardinal, who eventually became Cardinal Baldassare, who then, of course, did become a cardinal. One of the traditions is that he will be the first cardinal named in the first consistory of the new pope. It's a thank you to the cardinal, the archbishop, who helped run a conclave smoothly that led to the election of the new pope.
Didn't happen in the two previous ones, and Cardinal Baldassare, who eventually started to run the synod, was basically publicly begging for the red zucchetto. And I think out of charity, that's what Pope Francis gave him. Who knows what will happen this time? It's a tradition that shouldn't be imposed on a successor of St. Peter,
right,
because he himself has got to determine whether he would want Archbishop Montanari to enter into the College of Cardinals with all the duties that are incumbent.
Right, and we'll see, will he or will he not give him the red zucchetto, or is he giving it to him simply as a memento?
That's true. Is it? I think one thing that's worth clarifying that we didn't talk about in the fabulous package that you put together is his role, Montanari's role. He is an archbishop. He is not in the room, right?
Typically, no. So the room is cleared, and his job is to facilitate throughout the conclave, to assist the dean, or who's the acting dean, to make sure that everything is going smoothly in close cooperation with the Master of Ceremonies, Archbishop Ravelli. But they might have a job in the first part of the session, but as always, extra homines, everyone but the cardinals out. And that's the job also of Cardinal Kuvakad, to keep opening and closing the door.
See,
Archbishop Montanari is the secretary for the dicastery for bishops. He's been for quite some time. Prior to that, he was an official there, helping process the proviste, they call it, the ternas coming from the various nuncios to propose to the Holy Father. So he's worked around bishops for many times, likewise around cardinals. And that's a normal thing, where the number two at the dicastery for bishops is often the secretary for the conclave.
It's interesting. I do think the opening and the closing of the door, though, is pretty important. It seems like a job that wouldn't be significant, but it is when you have this much going on and you want someone who's really going to pay attention to who's coming in and out of those doors.
So the junior deacon not only has the privilege to do that, but he also is the trash keeper. A couple nights ago, I was with the one who filled that role in 2013, Cardinal James Harvey, the archpriest of St. Paul outside the walls here, a native of Milwaukee. He was the youngest, or the junior cardinal deacon at the time. And so in addition to doing door duty, he was the one who would go around and pick up sort of the loose trash beyond the ballots, right? So beyond the valid ballots. And so a 52-year-old cardinal from India has that duty. He was in charge of the papal trips, and so often he might have to pick up what was left in the residences or on the planes, and so hopefully he'll do it with a smile.
And we'll have a lot of opportunity to dig more into the functioning and how every vote is handled. But you're right. Even the notes are supposed to be collected. There's an official record that is kept that only the Holy Father can see, the next Holy Father can see. But there's trash. You're supposed to pick it up, and that gets burned with the ballots for each session, too. So maintaining that secrecy.
Well, Matthew, the backup for the backup. There is a rock star of backups right now. It's Cardinal Parolin, right?
That's right.
What is the backup for the backup happening here? What is it that he's being asked to do?
Well, aside from the fact that he's, we always very technical, and you've been so helpful in always reminding us that he is emeritus right now, because they all lose his job.
That's right.
But his job in this conclave is going to fill in, not just for Cardinal Ray, but also for Cardinal Sandri. So his job is basically to oversee from the beginning to the end all of the functioning, the votes and everything else, and to make some of those spot decisions that might have to be made just in terms of timing and other things. He's helped by the fact that, as we've been saying, the process works. The process itself just unfolds, and his job is not to steer it, but to make sure that it's going smoothly. And I think he's certainly competent to do that. We have seen him very active in the Sede Vacanti, really from the beginning. He was there for almost every major event, so I think he anticipated what his role was going to be.
Now, Monsignor Landry, over the past couple of days, we have heard the rumors of him as one of the potential Italians, because that is the rumor, that they're looking not just for a European, but potentially for an Italian. What can you tell us about how that's evolved over time?
So Cardinal Parolin is known by everyone because of his travels on every one of the papal trips. The Secretary of State would always go for those. He would always receive any of the bishops' conferences that would come here. Every 5 years or so, they're supposed to come on an ad limina visit to meet with the Pope and visit literally the thresholds of the tombs of St. Peter here and St. Paul. And so he's well known. He's clearly competent with regard to everything that's happening inside the Vatican. And so people would know that he wouldn't be out of his depth if he were the successor of St. Peter. And so he began as one of the front runners in the minds of many of the cardinals as well as many of the journalists. And he's been getting scrutinized over the course of time. I think what we're seeing, to be blunt, is the vast majority of cardinals would be able to accept Pietro Parolin as a successor of St. Peter, but he might not be their first choice. And so that's what's happening here. And if he comes out of the gate first and he doesn't get 2/3 plus 1, he'll start to descend, whereas he might have been easily able to be a compromise candidate on day 3 or 4. If the referendum is he your first choice, and is he going to come out within a day after white smoke, that's a totally different question. And so that's what I think has been happening as we start to see so many of these media reports, that he's generally very well respected by pretty much everybody for his competence. At the same time, he might not be everybody's first choice. And so that's why we're seeing the waves or the undulations of support for him in the media.
Well, we know that this is the largest voting bloc, something that Pope Francis withered away at little by appointing people from other places, but still a very significant and very influential group of men. Let's learn a little bit more about them.
The single largest group of cardinals in the conclave, set to begin on May 7th, is from Italy. There are 17 Italian cardinal electors, the largest number of voters from one country by far, with the cardinals from the United States second with 10, followed by Brazil with 7. Still, while numerically the largest body of electors entering the conclave, the number of Italian cardinal electors has declined since the last conclave. In 2013, there were 28 Italians out of a total of 115 voting cardinals. Nevertheless, the influence of the Italians remains significant, both because of the numbers, but also because they hold significant positions in the Roman Curia and are some of the best-known members of the College of Cardinals. The Italian electors also very much represent the engagement of Pope Francis with the Italian Church, as he appointed all but 2. There are 7 cardinals currently serving in the Roman Curia or Vatican City, meaning they hold positions of prominence in the governance of the Church. They include Cardinal Marcello Semeraro, 77, prefect of the Dicastery for the Causes of Saints, Cardinal Angelo De Donatis, 71, major penitentiary of the Apostolic Penitentiary, and one of the few cardinals to retain his office in the interregnum. The 60-year-old Scalabrinian missionary Cardinal Fabio Baggio, Undersecretary of the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development, and the 59-year-old Franciscan Cardinal Mauro Gambetti, Archpriest of St. Peter's Basilica, best known for his involvement in the 2021 restrictions on private masses and also the celebration of the traditional Latin Mass in the Basilica. The youngest of the curial Italians is the 54-year-old Cardinal Baldassare Reina, recently appointed Vicar General for the Diocese of Rome, who has implemented Pope Francis's dramatic overhaul of the Diocese of Rome's leadership and organization. Cardinal Claudio Gugerotti, 69, prefect of the Dicastery for the Eastern Churches, is a seasoned Vatican diplomat and expert in liturgy who knows both the Eastern Catholic Churches and the Orthodox world very well. He was considered a possible alternative to Cardinal Matteo Zuppi as the Pope's envoy, trying to bring an end to the war between Russia and Ukraine. By far, the most notable cardinal from among the Italians is the 70-year-old Cardinal Pietro Parolin, Vatican Secretary 13 and a cardinal since 2014. Parolin is ranked among the strongest contenders to succeed the late Holy Father and will be the most active member of the cardinal bishops in the conclave. He is not without his critics, however, and has received sharp criticism for the deal between the Holy See and Communist China and the appointment of bishops that has been violated repeatedly by Beijing. Two others are connected closely to the Holy See in their offices. The first is Cardinal Mario Zenari, 79, the Apostolic Nuncio to Syria, and the other is Cardinal Fernando Filoni, also 79, the Grand Master of the Equestrian Order of the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem, and a Benedict XVI appointee as cardinal. Both are respected diplomats, and Filoni is especially known internationally given his years in service around the globe, his tenure as the prefect of the then Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples, overseeing the Church's massive work of evangelizing all the corners of the globe, and as Grand Master of an order of knights and dames with 30,000 members worldwide. The remaining Italian cardinals serve in different dioceses and archdioceses across Italy. As he did in other countries, such as the United States and France, Pope Francis left some of the major archdioceses in Italy without cardinals, meaning that in this conclave there will be no electors from historically important sees such as Venice and Milan. The residential Italian cardinals are Cardinal Giuseppe Bettori, 78, Archbishop Emeritus of Florence, who was named a cardinal by Benedict XVI, Cardinal Oscar Cantoni, 74, Bishop of Como, Cardinal Francesco Montenegro, 78, Archbishop Emeritus of Agrigento, and Cardinal Giuseppe Petrocchi, 76, Archbishop of L'Aquila. The 62-year-old Cardinal Domenico Battaglia, Archbishop of Naples, is called a street priest for his pastoral outreach among the poor and addicts, and he is famed for his opposition to the mafia. Another cardinal known as a street priest is a 60-year-old Archbishop of Siena, Colle di Valdelsa, Montalcino, Cardinal Augusto Paolo Lo Giudice. One of the youngest members of the college, Lo Giudice stands in total alignment to Pope Francis's sensibilities, especially in reaching out to the peripheries and welcoming immigrants. Another Francis protege, the 58-year-old Cardinal Roberto Repole, Archbishop of Turin since 2022 and a cardinal since December 2024, is among the most progressive Italian prelates and a leader among the group of Italian theologians and clerics calling for reforms in line with their own vision of the Second Vatican Council. In the conclave, while not considered a candidate, he will work to galvanize support for the most progressive candidate. Finally, apart from Cardinal Parolin, the 69-year-old Archbishop of Bologna, Cardinal Matteo Zuppi is the best known and influential of the Italian cardinals and ranked on many lists of papabili. President of the Italian Bishops' Conference and well-known globally for his role as the Pope's envoy for peace in Ukraine, he is viewed as a politically astute moderate, but who also stands firmly in the camp calling for continuity with Pope Francis's vision for the Church. At the Vatican, Benedictia de Grian for EWTN News.
I love our EWTN News team. Benedict does a fabulous job, not only narrating because we love her beautiful voice, she's also a vocalist, but I think also providing just the right amount of information. We just talked about how Pope Francis doesn't have a lot of influence, but right here in this block of people, he certainly did.
Yes.
What can you tell us about those 17?
Well, the fact that he named all but two. So this was a pretty clean slate of Italian cardinals representing certainly his vision for the Italian Church, and the see change was significant. As we noted, too, that some of the major sees, including Milan, there is no cardinal here from there. So that is in keeping with Francis's tradition of bypassing major sees. Some he's appointed from major ones. I think of Turin, for example. But that mark is very distinct. The other thing to note is how young many of these cardinals are. We talked about Roberto Repore. From Turin, who is a theologian. He's in his late 50s, so he's going to be in the college for a very long time.
Something that we saw over and over again, whether they were Italian or not. Monsignor Landry, though, when you think about the opportunity to name a cardinal, it's a little bit like a Supreme Court justice. You know, you can't just name them because you feel like it, or I guess you could fire them, but not really. Is it just Providence, too, that allowed for this kind of a sea change?
Pope Francis himself was strategic in what he was doing, and occasionally he was a little bit whimsical. He had never really had conversations with some of them, and they're only finding it out when their WhatsApp and their messages are going wild when Pope Francis reads their name after a Regina Caeli or after an Angela. In Italy in particular, as Bishop of Rome, he took his leadership responsibilities very seriously. So he wanted to influence the Italian Bishops' Conference very much. So he has the right to appoint who's going to be the head of the Italian Bishops' Conference, unlike in other places in the United States, for example, where the bishops elect who's going to be their president. the Pope appoints the president here. He also appoints his assistants to run it. And he did so wanting specifically for his idea of synodality to become a reality here in Italy. And a lot of his appointments were those who would agree with that notion of synodality, which we've talked about already on our program. Pope Francis here in Italy recognized that as the church in Italy goes, there's an enormous influence all across the globe. And so he dedicated a lot of his energies to trying to reform, would be what he would have said, the hierarchy here in Italy. He combined a lot of dioceses into one because he thought that there were too many bishops. But then he focused on who the bishops were, and then he focused on who the leaders among those bishops were, and then finally who the cardinals were. It is unbelievable that we're going to have a conclave in which there's no cardinal from Venice or Milan. Those two sees have provided so many recent popes, and they're probably both in mourning, much like those in Philadelphia and Detroit and Baltimore.
Yeah, and Mario Delpini up in Milan was a Francis appointee.
Yep.
So it's fascinating.
I think that is remarkable. Again, that change, the change of influence, the change of tradition in some ways. Certainly, I think if you mentioned Philadelphia, we've had plenty of people, part of our live coverage, who have mentioned that they are in mourning for their lack of influence. But I think well represented by the group of 10 that are here now. When we think about those who are Italian, there's also such a thing as Italian adjacent, I would call it. Those who were either born in Italy but appointed to a really prominent place outside of Italy, or those who have Italian heritage, speak Italian very well, have a fluency within the society and the culture that would allow them to really speak into this moment. Obviously, I'm thinking of the newly made Cardinal Leo out of Toronto, who is Italian and speaks beautiful, beautiful Italian, comes from Italian immigrant parents, as well as Marengo, who obviously is very young and out in Mongolia, but a cardinal who is, again, very much here. And, of course, the much talked about Cardinal Pizzaballa, who I don't think needs 50 more introductions. What can you say about those who are adjacent? Is it their youth that will disqualify them?
Yeah, I think the main thing you hear about Cardinal Marengo and Cardinal Pizzaballa and Cardinal Leo is that they're too young. It would be a question of whether the conclave, whether the cardinal electors would want to elect someone pope who could be pope for 32 years. You know, Pius IX was pope for 32 years. Many would say he had a pretty good run as pope.
St. Peter, 34 years.
Yes. John Paul II was 58 at the time of his election.
That's right.
He reigned for 25 years. Now, you also have to be careful what you're assuming, because Gioacchino Pecci was elected in 1878, took the name Leo XIII, and literally buried every one of his electors save one. He was pope for 25 years and died at the age of 93. So the idea then that someone is a papa de passaggio, as they say, someone who's going to be around just for a few years, you have to be very careful about making too many assumptions. In much the same way that they assumed that Pope Francis would be around 5-6 years. No, he was here for 12.
Well, age certainly matters, and you've got two 79-year-olds, Filoni and Zanari, who haven't really been talked about very much, but in my mind are worth discussing. Maybe if they're looking or thinking about a little less permanent of a change, something of a transition papacy, as some have called it, those would be worthwhile candidates. What can you tell us about those two?
Yeah, well, Mario Zanari is nuncio to Syria, one of the hardest posts anywhere. And I know, Father, you can talk a lot more about that.
Certainly in that eastern realm we've discussed quite a bit.
Exactly. Who has been nuncio under the horror show of Syria. Cardinal Filoni was in Iraq during the worst years of the the fall of Saddam, and then was brought back to Rome. Zanari is somebody who, while not necessarily considered papabile, gives connections to the nuncios who are here who are cardinals, and also can speak to the Middle East in a way that others simply don't have the authority to do. Filoni, in his many different roles, knows the Middle East, but now he also knows the global church, the missionary church, and, as was mentioned in our coverage tonight, because he's now also Grand Master of the Order of the Holy Sepulchre, he has that deep personal tie to the Holy Land, but also to the 30,000 members of the Order worldwide. So he travels extensively. How he finds the energy is just a fascination to me. But again, he has those ties, so his name has certainly been in the Italian press. I've been reading a lot about him in the Italian newspapers and elsewhere. Is he papabile? possible compromise candidate, but somebody, again, who can build bridges among the cardinals.
Again, 79 years old and speaking to something that we know has come up in the notes from the general congregations on the persecuted church.
Cardinal Filoni ran the Vatican, more or less as their chief of staff, their sostituto. He was the head of the missions of the church, what we now call the dicastery for evangelization. And so he knows everybody, and he would have a reputation. If they were concerned about running the Vatican, he's already shown that he can do it for Pope Benedict, and then a little bit at the beginning of Pope Francis. Cardinal Zanari has been an iconic figure of the church's presence in Syria. Because there weren't Latin Rite prominent figures, Pope Francis decided to make the nuncio to that country a cardinal, and he has used that office to try to bring perpetual attention there. I think that that's going to be his office in the church. I don't think he's going to be a big contender. Nobody's really talking about him. But Cardinal Filoni does get some mentions if the election goes late, of someone who has demonstrated knowledge of the church's situation across the globe, capacity to be able to lead. The only thing, like me, he's so short.
Well, Monsignor Landry, 10 years there. Junior, though, is Cardinal Zuppi, right? What can you tell us about him?
Cardinal Zuppi is one of the friendliest cardinals in the whole college. He was a pastor here in Rome of the very vibrant parish of Santa Maria in Trastevere, this side of the Tiber River. He's a member of the Sant'Egidio community that's not only very close to the poor, but also that's been involved in various international negotiations, bringing peace to certain countries. He was Pope Francis' legate, as we heard in the report, to try to bring about peace between Russia and Ukraine. So he is a person whom many on the progressive side look to because of his association with the Sant'Egidio community as a real hero already. He likewise has made some outreaches even to the traditional Catholic community, offering to celebrate traditional Latin masses and things like this. So he is someone who always catches attention because he's got such a loud personality and such great capacity. And so many of the more progressive cardinals and newspapers constantly keep Soups, as his name would translate in English, before everybody's eyes.
Do you have any other reasons, Matthew, to believe that he would be someone who is actually a contender, or should we kind of lower him on that list?
I think he is so prominent within the Italian church, president of the Episcopal Conference here, but also somebody who has been clearly tapped by Pope Francis. We have Francis's close ties to the Sant'Egidio community, which is also very influential in Italy and beyond, 70 countries they're in. But then the fact that Pope Francis chose him as his personal envoy to try to bring peace in Ukraine, rather than leaving it in the hands where it would traditionally rest, which is the Secretary of State,
that's right.
Cardinal Pietro Parolin. So it was a statement of trust on the part of Francis to Zuppi. It's also in some ways, and some have interpreted it as a kind of insult to the Secretary of State. But Francis liked his own diplomacy, and Zuppi was his guy. So if you're looking for somebody who is deeply in continuity with Francis, he's your man.
Now, quickly, we know that we talked about Pope Francis as the Bishop of Rome and how that local chatter really does matter, how the Roman citizens, those here every day, also their eyes and ears and what they comment really matters. Does he have a certain reputation here?
He does, but what's interesting is that when you look now across Italy, you have a number of former auxiliaries who are here, former priests who are here, street priests, the type of priests that Francis really liked. So they're occupying a variety of sees. So they, too, have a certain connection. We have to note very quickly, too, Cardinal Reina, who is the vicar here, Francis completely demolished the structure of the Diocese of Rome and rebuilt it. And that is worth noting, in part because it cost Cardinal Angelo De Donatis his job as vicar. But in his place was somebody who Francis also trusted. Now, I don't think Cardinal Reina is going to be Papabili, but he's emblematic, I think, of Francis's approach to things, of really leveling things and rebuilding them in exactly the same way that he largely has done with the Italian Episcopal Conference and with the structure of the Italian Cardinalate here.
Well, we'll certainly dig into that a little bit more tomorrow when we continue our live coverage here from St. Peter's Square and start talking about our last group of cardinals, the cardinals from Canada, and then get into the rules around the conclave, how those votes are actually going to function to prepare for our live coverage on Wednesday of both of those voting sessions and that opening Holy Spirit Mass for those who believe that this is just a horse race. It certainly is not. It is a praying moment for our church where we're going to call on the Holy Spirit, that last moment for the laity to walk in in and pray with the cardinals before they're sent off and sealed into the Sistine Chapel. EWTN family, we're so grateful that you can be with us on radio, listening around the world, of course, on YouTube, on Instagram, on all of the places where you are. EWTN is too. I want to give a special shout out to my mother. It's her birthday, and I'm not with her.
And I want to give a shout out to Luke Benoit, my godson, who is being confirmed tonight. I'm here, not as his sponsor. Congratulations, Luke. May the Holy Spirit come down on you.
Amen. Where's your shout out to your beautiful wife?
Yes, my wife Bonnie, who landed in Rome this morning, so everyone's happy.
There you go. Well, we're grateful for our families, obviously, and we're with them in spirit when we can't be there in person. And of course, with you, our EWTN family, we ask you again to search your hearts and partner with us as we bring the mission of our church, the love of Jesus Christ to the world through this live programming from St. Peter's Square. Thank you so much, Dr. Bunson and Monsignor Landry. We'll be back tomorrow at 7 p.m. Rome time to tell you more about what's happening here. God bless you.
From EWTN News Nightly, I'm Tara Mergener with an